and I'm hopeful, since this is a small group and that we can, it's a seminar, we can as much as possible have a dialogue. So I don't want to just sit here and ramble and be tedious. And to that end, you should always feel free to interrupt me at any, like if I'm saying something or any time you want to redirect, ask questions or comment, just raise your hand or just talk. You won't break my train of thought, I promise. I have a short attention span, so I can immediately be readjusted. But seriously, no, feel free to intervene at any time. So the theme of this seminar was close reading and its discontents, I guess I called it. So first thing I thought I would just ask is there a Korean equivalent for the term close reading? So like in English, like even in high schools now in English, it's become standard. You know, you tell them, you're going to write about the poem, you have to do a close reading. Is that? But is there, and then in college, I remember you go to college, they tell you, they say, now you're in college, now you have to do close reading. But is there any, but there's not precisely an equivalent in other European languages. Is there, what would you say in Korean if you want to tell somebody, you have to do a close reading? Is there a way to say it? Is that no? I think that's right. I mean, that's what you do in German or French often. I mean, French you could say, you know, explication of the text, but I think, and so there isn't a Korean equivalent of close reading.
There is no specific Korean term for close reading.
But what if you, yeah, go ahead.
But in Korean high school, how students learn a certain poem and get tested with it is really in a detailed manner.
Okay.
So I think the way we learn and get tested with a poem is
right.
similar to close reading.
Right. Okay. And as we'll talk about in a minute, I mean, the term close reading has an elaborate history and so forth. But part of why I'm interested in it is, and again, these are just what I wrote. I suppose I could just give you all this. I just wrote down sort of some introductory comments that I'll show you. Mostly because since we're just meeting each other, it's probably easy to follow everything the first time we talk. So, oh. No. No. If I moved it out of range, maybe I did that.
You could.
There you go. What did I do wrong?
You can
Just tap the net. Okay. So basically in North America, anybody involved in literature will acknowledge that close reading is important and will teach it. They will expect their students to do close reading. And what's interesting is that this term, close reading, has had currency for more than half a century, even though if you look at literary studies now, it's completely unlike literary studies was in the 1940s or 50s. And nonetheless, the term close reading and the authority it has not changed. And that in itself is an interesting question. In other words, how does this thing, again, I don't know what it is exactly, how does it persist despite all the other transformations? Okay? And what else is interesting about the term close reading is that ostensibly, if you were going to ask somebody, well, how is literary studies different from any other humanistic study? Something someone might say is, well, in literature you do close readings. And that's fine, except, and you know, in history, in art history, philosophy, anthropology, sociology, they might very well tell their students, read the text closely. So it's ostensibly, close reading is ostensibly something that belongs to literary studies, it came out of literary studies, and yet it can be adopted by all other fields. So that's, again, why that's possible, I think is. So, I've already alluded to a bunch of questions or problems come up. So the first one is, the term is just so vague. You know, it's almost as if it's so vague to the point of being trivial. Sometimes it just sounds like a synonym of like, pay attention. You know, close reading, don't sloppily read. You know, or say something about the text you can actually defend, don't just make it up. I mean, it's really on that level. It says, you know, just don't make it up. Okay. The term is so common, it's rarely ever discussed. And it's only recently, now that people have been talking about distant reading a little bit, that people have started saying, what is this close reading thing? It's like this universal term that you never examine. It's precisely because it's so prevalent. Somehow you never look at it and go, wait, what is it? And so the way I jokingly say that is, no one ever does a close reading of close reading. It's somehow not what you do. And then I sort of expand on that here. You rarely see anybody describe it. So you normally think that on the internet there's always an explanation of everything. But if you Google what is close reading, there are a couple websites, like there's something like, where people will try to give you a sort of step-by-step, this is how you would do it. But it seems almost to be impossible to actually, it's not a methodology you can lay out as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And in fact, many people say that the virtue of it is it's not pedantic. In other words, if it was just, do this, do that, do that, do that, it would be silly and mechanical. People say, no, it's not that. But as a consequence, sometimes someone, if you want to say, well, am I doing a close reading? How do you know if you are or not? And I don't mean this just as a joke, but this is actually a very serious question. We'll try to ask in the seminars. How does a reading prove that it's a close reading? In other words, if you're writing a paper about a poem, how do you prove I'm doing a close reading of the poem? How does your analysis prove that it's close? And so if you think it's not exactly a method, you might say, and people will say this, it's even more fundamental than a method. Close, it's like before methods. You could have lots of methods, but they would all rely on close reading. And again, that's potentially an odd idea. And then the question that falls from that is, well, if close reading takes a lot of different forms, is there something common to all close reading? Right? So you could read a lot of different texts. And another way to think about this, and to sort of go back to how vague is the term, is what's the opposite of close reading? Skimming, scanning, speed reading. And I should stress, people have raised the question of whether we are unfairly privileged close reading. In other words, like if you're reading Twitter or something, you're probably scanning, right? If you're reading the headlines, that's not necessarily bad. And you could argue, for example, with certain kinds of texts, you have to partly scan. For example, if you're studying a novel, there might be moments where you'd analyze one sentence. But there are other moments where you might be scanning across huge ranges of pages. So sometimes people say, we privilege this close thing, and it's unfair. So again, these are just things to think about. They're not. And then something that I'm interested in, we can talk about, is the word close. What always fascinates me is nobody ever questions that metaphor. I'm reading closely now. Right? It's a spatial model, but it's very consequential. Right? You could have said something different. So, for example, there was a famous literary critic in the 1950s who talked about slow reading, and he just meant it's not like you're at the beach and you're reading a mystery story, reading carefully. But that's slow is temporal. It's not spatial. So why has the spatial metaphor triumphed, whereas the temporal one, say, hasn't? And one other thing is, sometimes people will say, sort of sociological way, they'll say, well, close reading is just professional reading. That's like what you guys are doing. You're professionals, you're students, you're professors. You're doing professional reading. Everything else is just, people read on the subway or they read at home. Or that's just casual reading. And again, that has potentially political, sociological implications. Some people will say, we'll talk about this a little more, there's something elitist about close reading. Close reading is what you can do if you have the luxury of being a student, you have time, right? Someone who's running to work and reading their phone doesn't have time to be a close reader, right? Whereas you guys can all sit here and read the poem. So people wonder if there's a question there. A slightly more philosophical point, people say that, this is a critique of close reading, they say that the message of close reading is always, oh look, the interpreter is so clever. Right? And sometimes you read, so for example, like this essay by Paul de Man, right? Sometimes people say, oh, okay, all the essay is really about is how clever Paul de Man is. Right? And it's somehow, people say the problem with close reading is what it really ends up showing is just, oh, the interpreter was so sophisticated. Right? Now some people, for instance Paul de Man, will argue exactly the opposite. And they would say the virtue of close reading is that it takes all the subjective part out, right? And it really makes you focus on the text. And this is an example. So Paul de Man, who's this literary critic we'll talk about later, in the 1950s he taught in a very famous course at Harvard that was taught by a professor named Reuben Brouwer. And in this class at Harvard, they gave the students very specific instructions. So these are the instructions. You're writing about a poem. You can only say things that can be derived from the text. You can't say anything that's not supported by specific use of language in the text. You can't in any way move into the general context of human experience. And this often, if people in literary studies try to cite a definition of close reading, that paragraph will always, that's like cited everywhere, because here's someone actually explaining this is what close reading is. Me. And so Damon would say actually close reading is precisely a critique of the notion that it's always you, the interpreter, who's doing such clever things. It's making you be more objective. So that's, any questions, comments at this point? Concerns? Thoughts, reactions? Yeah?
Is close reading, is it born out of formalism? Because just doing the readings, that's kind of the impression I got, that it's something very much, as that quote shows, it's something very much self-contained within the text.
Yes, yes. That's a great point. And which formalists have you read? Have you read like Russian formalists or?
Not really.
Well, so close reading is, we'll talk about that, close reading sort of gets formulated in the 1940s and 50s, but it is contemporaneous with interests in Europe, both among some Slavicists, so Russian scholars, some Czech scholars, but also in France. It's contemporaneous with theories of reading that are what we today call formalist. And that's one of the things we'll look at this Brooks essay when he talks about structure. And we'll try to say, what is this structure? But absolutely, the critique of close reading that people might have is, it's a formalism, right? They'd say you're ignoring history, you're ignoring politics, you're ignoring culture, you're ignoring biography. You know, it's a formalism. That's absolutely the critique people would make, absolutely. And it's certainly the case, I mean, again, in a broader study, we could ask, you know, why are formalisms so popular in the middle of the 20th century? That would be like an intellectual history question, because it's really the case that across a lot of different countries, in a lot of different fields, not just literature, as you know, structuralism was a very popular theory, you know, that's in anthropology, originally in history. So there's a certain time, if you're doing an intellectual historian one day, one of you can write a book or something about why formalism was so popular at a certain point. And again, these things, they go in and out of fashion. You'll see as you study longer, you know, for 10 years, some formalism will be in, and then formalism will be out, in and out. But absolutely, that would be a critique, is formalism. Any other questions at this point? Concerns? So this is now we're going to historicize. So close reading is anti-historicist, but here's the historicization of close reading. So basically, what happened in the United States is after the Second World War, a larger sector of the population started going to college. There was more government support for college, much broader range of people going to college. And the people who taught literature courses realized, well, it used to be we had a smaller range of people here. They'd all gone to these really fancy preparatory schools. They had all studied literary history. We could assume a huge amount of knowledge. Now we have a much broader group. None of them have read the same things. So when you assign a Keats poem, you can't trust that they've read Milton and da-da-da-da. What do? The solution is close reading. Because the beauty of close reading, right, is we put the poem in front of us. We're not allowed to refer to anything else. We all start at the same place. It's democratic. It doesn't matter. You went to a super fancy high school. You went to a super fancy high school. You and I, we didn't go to a super fancy. It doesn't matter. Because we're not allowed to talk about, Tennyson or this or that. No. So none of your, so it takes out the kind of fancy, pretentious references. Well, that reminds me of that. No. Just comment on the language. And one thing is, as you go on and you teach your own classes, you'll realize it's pedagogical gold. because you sit here and go blah, 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 everyone's bored. But no, you say, all right, let's look at the poem they're talking about. Everybody can do it. Everyone can participate. Everyone can get something out of it in a very concrete way. If the moment you teach a literature course, you realize this is how to do things. Now, it's a very interesting thing. Why would a discipline almost come to be defined by a pedagogical strategy? In other words, it's so pedagogically powerful. And even to this day, people will say there are many professors, many people, literature professors, whose work is not formalist, it's not close reading, but that's how they teach. So, because that's what works in class. So it's a very funny thing. You can see some of the most ardent, anti-formalists ever. You know, they'll be giving a lecture yelling about formalism. They'll go to seminar, all right, we're gonna read the poem first. Yeah, what, wait, what? And it's a very strange thing. That's a thing to think about. Why is it that this pedagogical thing would be so powerful? So this actually then was canonized in a very famous book called Understanding Poetry. You should look at it sometime. It's an interesting book, 1938, written by Cleant Brooks, who wrote this essay you read, and Robert Penn Warren. And this book was literally a textbook for teachers. And it was published as a textbook. So it's a famous work of literary criticism, but it's a textbook. So if you imagine, like when imagine a math textbook or something being a famous math book. That's what this was. And so this is their book. And it starts out with a letter to the teacher. So you guys are the teacher, and the letter tells you, the book is going to show you how to teach your students to do close reading. And it starts out by listing what you're not supposed to do. So the whole essay you read today, Heresy of Paraphrase, is all a justification of number one. Don't paraphrase. Don't study biography. And then they put it in positive terms. Look at the poem, concrete, inductive. Treat the poem as an organic system of relationships. Now, the question I immediately ask there is, are 2 and 3 contradictory? Does anyone want to comment on that? Could you see why that might be? It's interesting, there's no blackboard in the screen. It's going to write something.
Well, there's a whiteboard behind the screen.
Ah, maybe we'll get it out later. Maybe it's wrong. But can anyone see why 2 and 3 might not be consistent? Or let's think about 2. So the treatment should be concrete and inductive. What does that mean? Let's look, actually, since you guys have some poems, let's look at these ones just very casually. This by William Carlos Williams. Remember the Red Wheelbarrow? These really short ones. The Red Wheelbarrow is 1923. See, I've already historicized. I told you the date. I shouldn't have even told you who wrote these. She said I wrote them. Oh, I don't have a book for them. Sorry. It's the first day. Would you know the page? Someone knows it? It's at the bottom of the top page is the Widow's Lament in Springtime, and then the one below. It doesn't matter. What page?
Does it have a page number? It's towards the beginning. It's after Principles of Literary Criticism.
Right.
It's after page 121, but these aren't actually all.
Yeah. All right. It doesn't matter. Anyway, so a poem. Okay, there you go. So these are by William Carlos Williams, although we don't have to know that. So we're looking at the Red Wheelbarrow. Now, our treatment should be concrete and inductive. What does that mean? What does inductive mean here? Any thoughts? So we're going to study the poem. Our treatment would be inductive. What would that mean? Indeed.
Right.
So what would be, all right, well let's again, what would be a deductive approach to a poem like the Red Wheelbarrow? So how would that work out in a reading of a poem?
Find out the general theme, and then you can try to prove that in specific examples.
Okay. So for example, you might say, oh, I've read other William Carlos Williams poems. I know they're all about X. Therefore, I'm going to show how this poem is about X. And that would be a deductive. Another version of that, and there's a million versions of this, right? It could be like, well, I know poetry is always about something fiddly, so I will show the poem is about something. It's starting from a general premise and then showing. It's sort of like deciding in advance what you're going to find, right? And again, it's very hard not to read a little bit that way. In other words, it's easy to say don't be deductive, but the very fact that we've identified this and we say that's a poem and we all agree on that, that's already a deduction. We've decided this is what a poem is, that's a poem. We've decided a lot of things. We've decided it's readable. I don't mean this as a joke either. We've decided there's something to say about it. Right? We could be walking down the street and see a mark on the wall of graffiti, and we might just assume there's nothing to say about that. People disagree, but the point is we've all decided this is meaningful, it's worth talking about, it's worth our time. There's so many assumptions we've already made. Those are all on the level of deduction. There's some sense, or they're gonna prove themselves once we look at the poem. We've decided in advance. But induction means what then? What's the opposite?
Taking something specific out of text
Right.
and format.
Right. And it's that's in some ways the easiest thing to say, but of course also the hardest. You know, I mean it's you can really scrutinize what happens when you do that. But yeah, that's the goal. Now, but then this third requirement. The poem is an organic system of relationships. And the poetic quality should never be understood as inhering in one or more factors taken. What does that even mean? What does organic mean here? Organic is a word that makes some people very uncomfortable. For example, like historically, like for example, in discussions of European Romanticism, sometimes people will say they have romantic theories, organic theories of the state. This is sometimes people think that's very threatening. What does organic mean here? It's an organic system of relationships.
All are related, or yeah.
Yeah, okay, everything's related. So,
This means a kind of natural unity amongst the elements.
okay, it's a natural unit. Well, first of all, there is a unity. That will be, you'll see in the Heresy paraphrase. The poem can be treated as a unity, as a unit. It's a unity of elements. That's a huge assumption, right? That's an enormous, and they don't just make it as an assumption. They're really going to argue this. Like, they will write books where they'll read poem after poem after poem, and they will try to show you, look, the poem is this unit of elements. That's what makes it a poem. It doesn't, but that's a big step. You can write your own book about how big a step that is. It's an organic unity. Okay. And it also implies there are all these parts, everything is sort of where it should be. Everything's doing what it's supposed to be doing, right? Like in an organism, you say, well, it has a circulatory system and a respiratory system and the liver and the kidneys and the skin and everything has a role, everything has a function, but it's only all those things put together that make the thing what it is, okay? But again, that's a very big claim. And then the interesting thing they add is, what's poetic is not just one thing in isolation, it's all of that together. So if we look back at this Red Wheelbarrow poem, you're not allowed to say, well, what's poetic is that it's broken into lines. Okay, that's true, that's part of it, but that's only one part, right? They would say you can't, or, what's poetic here is the lines are very short, or they follow a pattern. 3 words, 1 word, 3 words, 1 word. They say, yeah, that's all true, that's part of it, but that's just one part. So somehow, according to them, to prove it's a poem, you'd have to show how, we could make a list of 100 details, right? They're all going to go together. That's why it'll be a poem. That's the claim. Now, my question is that already not really inductive? In other words, they claim we're going to be inductive, but then they're also moving from the whole, the general, to the parts. And you can even see this, it's interesting. So for example, Brooks and Warren will say this. There was another new critic named John Ransom. Don't have to know this, but he was very concerned that he said the way we work in literary studies is we break everything into parts. We do analysis, we break it down. That's almost maybe the opposite of what they're saying, putting everything together as a unit. And yet these are people of the same sort of generation, both advocates of close reading, but one of them is saying we want to break everything down into parts, and the other is saying we want to unify everything. Okay? And so that's contradictory. You say, how is that? That's part of what is interesting about studying this concept close reading, is you sometimes see that it masks over very basic tensions. And that's really my interest in sort of directing your attention to it, is to see, like, if we just say close reading all the time and we never think about what it's doing, you start to realize all the kind of, it's like you lift the lid on the pot, and all these things bubbling underneath. So that's a question. I can also, I can email you guys this PowerPoint if it's useful, or something, I don't know, anyway. Okay, another thing that's related to this, so we're back in the history now, we're historicizing. One of the concerns in the middle of the 20th century was trying to make literary studies a more legitimate field in the academy. So early in the 20th century, literary studies was largely philology, very old-fashioned kind of stuff you would never do now, probably like, it's weird, some dictionary things, whatever. And it didn't have that much standing in the academy. And one of the ways they thought to give literary studies more standing was, well, to make it more objective, more systematic, like science. Science was, of course, always the model. How can we be more like science? And so close reading is partly like saying, look, they have the scientific method, we do close reading. They do experiments and they induce things, we study poems, and there's very much a concern to be systematic like the scientists. Now, a very important figure here is this guy, I.A. Richards. He was a scholar at Cambridge. And he was very interested in showing that aesthetics could be a science, that you could study poetry. He did these amazing experiments with his students at Cambridge. He gave them poems, and he made them analyze them without any reference to anything. And then he wrote an entire book about their analyses. That's what this book is called, Practical Criticism. He's actually going through and analyzing how his different students would write about the same poems. It's really quite, again, it's very hard to imagine doing that today, but he does this. It's a very fascinating book if you get a hold of it and look at it. Just read a few pages, you'll see. It's very interesting. And here's the interesting thing about Richards, I think. So Richards is always talking about we have to examine the poem closely, do close reading. He's always talking about this. But he says the reason we have to do that is because the poem itself was written closely. And he says that the reason you examine it closely is because the poem is this closely knit structure. He says, the quote here in the middle, ideas are closely packed together. So in other words, when Richards looks at a poem like this, he says, in contrast to the newspaper or even a novel or something, this is dense. Everything's close, whatever that word means, right? I don't know, they look like the words are spaced just like everything else. But no, he's like, it's close. Therefore, you have to read it closely. Okay? And this is one of the biggest, so according to him, read it closely because the poem is written closely. And this is, to me, one of the most interesting, maybe the hardest questions we might think about. And again, we won't answer in the seminar, you guys can go on to work on this, is if you have a model of reading, do you also have to have a model of the text? So he's saying, I have a model of close reading, and it's partly based on the idea that a model of the text is this close, densely packed thing. In other words, if you're going to tell us how to read, you also have to, in some sense, have a theory of what it is we're reading. Okay? Any questions about that so far? Again, it's a very big issue. Comment? Now, it raises a question, which is, originally in the 1940s, they said, all right, we got all these people coming to college. We want them to read poems. We don't want them to read poems the way they read the sports pages or the movie pages. We want them to read them as poetry. They're serious. But the funny thing now is today, in literary and cultural studies, people close read everything. People do close read the graffiti on the walls. They close read advertisements. They close read shoe labels. They close everything. They close read cup design. It doesn't matter. I was thinking that was empty. I was going to throw the water. They close read everything. So there's a weird irony here that close reading was invented so you read the poem as a poem and not like everything else. And yet it's such a good method. Now you use it to read everything. So it's almost like it betrays itself in a funny way. Or another way you could put this. So it's like if you study philosophy at all, anyone ever read Nietzsche or something? One of the things Nietzsche is interested in is things are invented for one purpose, but then they have other purposes. So this was invented, quote unquote, not invented, but this was privileged to separate poetry from everything else, and then gradually it's used to expand the definition. Everything's part of it, right? Now, I mentioned earlier about close reading that some people say it's anti-elitist. It's democratizing. Doesn't matter. We all start from the same place. We all have the same thing in front of us. Other people think that's false. They say no. They say if you teach your students and you're not teaching them history, and you're not teaching them politics, you're just teaching this formalism, in some sense you're protecting the status quo. In other words, their argument is if all you teach is close reading, you're not giving your students the knowledge they need so they can really challenge the system or something like that. So there's some people who think ideologically close reading. And that today, like if you ask your average literary scholar about the new critics, they would say, oh yes, they're very important, but they had ideological problems. They were ahistorical. They didn't worry about politics. Some would even say they were all conservative Southerners, blah, blah, blah. But the funny thing is, those people who would make all those critiques would still use close reading. So you would criticize these guys. These people are politically reprehensible, but I need their stuff. And it's like, and there's something about close reading, you can't give up on it. So you make the most vociferous critiques, and then you go do it. And that's one of the weird things about it. Interesting things about it. Stuff. Okay, so these are then just some background questions that we've already raised, but just things you might think about in the course of the seminar. First one I said very early on, how does a reading show that it's close? Whenever, my students write papers and I say, you need to read the text more closely. How can you write the paper so that I can't possibly say that? So I say, good job, you read the paper. Second question I just was talking about is, what does it mean now that you read everything, right? People read tweets closely. I read tweets closely. I actually wrote this long article about Twitter, if you're interested. Analyzing tweets. Are there certain texts you can't read closely? In other words, are there certain kinds of texts? This goes back to Richard's thing. He says the dense text you have to read closely. Are there texts that aren't dense, that you shouldn't read closely, that it would be wrong? We'll talk about that a bit with the Dumas and the novel. Can you do a close reading of a novel? He reads like one line in the novel. It's a 7-volume novel. He reads a line. Right? So maybe. Then this question of alternatives, particularly distant reading, which we'll talk about later in the week, getting a lot of attention lately. What's always struck me about these conversations is, strangely enough, it seems easy to formulate alternatives to close reading without actually first saying what it is. Right? It's like you were saying, well, I've always been doing things this way, but I won't tell you what that is. But now I'll do an alternative. How do you know? Why is it so different? There are many views on this. We can talk about that. So this is sort of a long introduction, if not too tedious. Questions at this point? Comments, thoughts, just reactions? And again, not so much even things we have to decide now, but things we'd like to think about more in the course of the week. We can see.
I think this is interesting because in the earlier part of the course, one of the books that we referenced on Boston's dialogue in the novel, and how for him, the discourse of the novel and the discourse of poetry is essentially different. So you can't use the same lens to analyze these fundamentally different types of texts.
Excellent.
So,
Yeah. No, that's a great point. That for Bakhtin, the novel, as you know, is this kind of it's like a sea of different discourses all intersecting, in a way that this Red Wheelbarrow is somehow not. Although, again, people would disagree. Some people would say you can find heteroglossia in that, Some people would say the whole language is heteroglossic, but no, absolutely. The idea that there might be a difference. The other question is, if you're Bakhtinian, can you nonetheless read closely, even if you don't think that the text itself has to be so separated off? And that's that interesting thing about the unity versus the induction. In other words, couldn't you still do the inductive analysis, even if you're not treating your text as some isolated, separate thing? More like a novel where it's all these things intersecting. That's certainly what people do now. There are many of people who love Bakhtin but would use certain kinds of inductive analyses. But yeah, I think that's a great point of contrast. What are other literary critics you've read who have sort of identifiable methods? I think they do. Yeah. Anybody come to mind? Other theorists?
Said is very good here. Well, not as much anymore, but yeah.
No, Said. Okay.
It's like a default.
Said is that's interesting. And what kind of critic is Said? That's actually an interesting question. Yeah. But what does that mean? Said does analyses of texts. Or think of, somebody they say is maybe the inventor, sometimes she's called, of post-colonial studies, this guy Spivak. Do you know Patrick Spivak? You read anything by Spivak? When I was in college, when I was maybe your age, maybe even younger, I went to a lecture by Gayatri Spivak, and I thought she was like, I literally sitting there, I thought in the audience, like, she must be 7 feet tall. She was like this giant, she's up there, and you're just like in awe, you're like, ah. And then years later, when I was doing my PhD, I was at a party or something, and she was there, and I realized like I was like, wait, she's not 7 feet tall. I was so proud. I was so disillusioned. She was a giant. She was like this small person. What happened? But she was even wearing combat boots when I saw her. She still wasn't the big boot, didn't have. But I remember when I first. Anyway, Gayatri Spivak is often thought of as the one of the founders of post-colonial studies. She does all sorts of readings of texts. Partly in Bakhtinian ways, partly showing intersections of discourses, but certainly specific analyses. But yeah, someone like Said, I mean, this is an interesting thing. I mean, a lot of the sort of famous texts in post-colonial theory, in many ways, presume a lot of this work. I mean, they're trying to break from it in certain ways. But part of the, they also take a lot from it. And that's one thing you'll see sometimes in literary studies, everyone's always focusing on the points of disagreement. You sometimes forget there's 90% you agree on, The actual disagreement is very small. All right, so why don't we do the following? Let's look then at this text by Clement Brooks, The Heresy of Paraphrase. And as I said, this heresy of paraphrase is really just an entire essay to justify point 1. Don't paraphrase. Right? When they start their book, Understanding Poetry, they're like, don't do this. So he writes this essay. So there's various ways we could go about this. But I was thinking, maybe we could just start on, I'm looking at the very beginning, so page 177, at the lower half of the page. He says, what's commonly good about these poems is not content or subject matter, but structure. And really, in a sense, everything that will follow in the essay will be an effort to explain what that word structure is. You could do a very interesting class on the 20th century in literary studies on the different uses of the word structure. People use it, again, it's probably the word structure, it's an easy word. Once you start using it, you throw it around, the structure. So what do you mean? Tell us what you mean. So he writes a whole essay trying to explain what he means by structure. And he spells it out a little bit more on the next page, the first complete paragraph. But though it is in terms of structure, the term structure is not altogether satisfactory. This is a classic gesture in literary studies. You're like, we're going to use this term, but it's not quite right. But there isn't a better one. That's always a very weird rhetorical, it's a very tricky rhetorical gesture. Like, you should use this in your own writing. When you're like, I'm going to use this term, it's not quite right, but it's the best I had. There's a weird kind of like, there's like a humbleness about it. You're like, sorry, it's not my fault, but the alternative is like to make up your own words. People do, right? People coin lots of words, but it's a very weird gesture. It's not quite right, but I'm going to use it. Okay? Now, what does he? And then he immediately then starts talking about the word form. We talked about formalism. What's a form? So, what is a structure? How does he think about structure? What's his answer? What is structure? Can I really produce a whiteboard? Or I have to flip this up. There's a whiteboard on the other side of it. Or no, it's right behind it.
It has wheels, so you can pull it out and...
And the screen does not. Aha. I'm sure I'm going to make a hash of these.
Why not those plugs?
Help you.
I need help.
Are the markers?
Yes, I'm going to throw it. I see the markers. Genius. All right.
If the markers don't work, there are some up there as well.
Hey, there's not the markers.
Let me just remove this one because this one's printed.
That, yeah, the thread of the permanent markers. You want to put it, okay. All right, so.
Yay.
Thank you very much for your help. You trapped? Thank you, although we'll never see you again. So you got structure, we got form. So, how does he think about structure? What did he try to say? What's structure? What does it not make it?
It's not confined to the metrical pattern of
Right.
poem, so more.
Yeah, let's even read that. Let's read exactly what he says.
Right.
He says, one means by it something far more internal than.
Right.
What does that mean? And again, I would encourage, with literary studies, now we're trying to close read the text about close reading, but with literary studies, the way you make progress is by seizing on something and not deciding you know what it means. Or because with all these guys, so like this guy Paul Dumont, I once took a course where we spent most of the semester on about 5 pages of an essay he wrote. Literally going word by word and literally just asking, why that word and not that word? It was like doing medieval studies of, something like the Bible. But it was incredible. You realize, you learn to read things, you get confident, you throw stuff around, instructions, and then someone calls you on it, they say, wait, explain why, and tell me, I don't know. And I've seen these people do things, they do it for years. No one ever, you go a whole career, right? Your career as a professor, you spend, you're 70 years old, and someone says to you, wait a minute. Why? And then tell me, why that word? So one means, so this phrase is great. Far more internal than. What does that mean? I mean, already right there, put the marker somewhere else. Anyway, we got one. So far more internal. So this is that. Now, okay, we have this term internal. All right. What does internal presuppose? Okay, it presupposes there's an inside and there's an outside. And it also presupposes there's a continuum. You can be more inside. It's degrees, right? More inside, more outside. It's not just either or. It's not on, off, right? It's, you're more inside and you're less inside. More internal, less internal. Okay, why not? So it's far more internal than the metrical pattern. So right there, you have to understand, there's a whole, part of what he's trying to do, right, is he's trying to develop a model of the literary text. This is what a lot of literary criticism is about, trying to model language, okay? And so right there, metrics is less internal than something else, structure. Now, that doesn't imply that metrics is external. It's just less internal, okay? So if we had this continuum, we put metrics here, say, or something like that. You don't necessarily know, what's more external? What's more external than metrics? What's the outside? Forms external. I don't know. No, I mean, it's a good question.
The author's state of mind.
Okay, that's nice. Psychology. So Shakespeare was in a bad mood that morning. And look at Macbeth. If only he'd been in a better mood, he wouldn't have Macbeth. Okay, yeah. Something really, that's a very nice example. That's super external. That continuum, yeah. His bad mood back in, 16, my dates. Okay, the state of mind of the author when he or she wrote the thing is way outside. What else? What's a little less external than that, but still more external? No, that's great. I like that. Let's try to move down the continuum. What would be less external, but not quite internal? Very nice. Okay, the genre would be external to the structure of the text. Genre is a tricky one. I mean, genre, there's this whole question of induction versus deduction with genre. I mean, genre, in a sense, genre exists partly because of this problem of induction, deduction. In other words, genre exists precisely to tell you what you're reading before you read it. There's some people who think that genre categories are very suspect, that, again, they're literally like the word close reading. Like you say, that's a lyric poem. Some people would say that term is designed to cover up a lot of problems we don't want to ask about lyric poems. We just label them all lyric poems and we don't have to deal with a bunch of stuff. Genre can be a very defensive, potentially. Not necessarily. But that's okay, genre is interesting. What about, I mean, he says, I mean, again, it's very weird how he gets in trouble here. So, the structure is not form in the conventional sense, and then you're sort of like, I hope he explains what that means. He does. But I mean, that's always a really annoying thing, right? Oh, I didn't form in the conventional sense. Who, what? Here's now the conventional sense. Form as a kind of envelope which contains the content, which itself is a great metaphor. Now, so now he says, don't mean, and I love the word certainly there. It's certainly not that, like that would be a bad thing. Oh, okay. But, so, form versus content. And he says the form is like an envelope contains something. Is that a good way to think about form and content? How do you normally think about form and content in a poem?
I would think that the form is how the content is organized.
Okay. And so what's wrong then with the envelope model?
And the form would be the structure. The bones of the content, not this, well, as an envelope I would think more of skin.
Yeah. But I mean, with an envelope, right, like, so I could have an envelope, a larger one, I could put a paper clip in it, I could put a pen in it. Their shape isn't determined by the envelope. I mean, it's broader parameters. I can't put a wheelbarrow. Well, not even a red wheelbarrow. But for example, like I was thinking, like, okay, I have this cool ice cube tray where it has a pattern in the shape of an owl. So if you pour ice in, you make ice cubes that look like an owl. It is pretty cool. And I have these friends who are always making these owl jokes about, so if you ever read Hegel, so Hegel writes, the German philosopher, he has this famous line where he says, the owl of Minerva, so that's wisdom, Athena, only takes flight at dusk. So the owl of wisdom only takes off at dusk. We always make all these owl jokes. We're really a crazy bunch. Wow. What else do you do? So I have these owl ice cubes. So that would be a thing where the form of the plastic tray I pour the water in really does shape exactly what's in it. In a way that an envelope is a little less. Now again, an envelope is not, not totally permissive. I can get a piece of paper in there. I can maybe get some paper. I can't get a wheelbarrow. But it's not that intimate a relationship, this container model. If I have a big container, I throw anything in there. It's not changing. The content in that sense is not actually shaped by the form. I think normally that's what's sort of a little problematic with the envelope model, is that normally you would think that, maybe you would think this is again, you could ask why. You would think that content and form in a poem are a lot more interdependent. In other words, and in a sense, that's what he's going to argue, right? Like, he really needs it to be the case that the relationship between form and content really, really matters. And he says this on the previous page, on 177. He says, he distinguishes subject matter and structure. So it's important for him, this is the weird thing, it's important for him to be able to distinguish those two things. The structure and the subject matter are not the same thing. But it's of course also going to be very important to him that they're organically interrelated. Right? They're interrelated just as much as your respiratory system and your circulatory system are interrelated, right? So he makes this double gesture. They have to be different, but they have to sort of inform each other. And again, typically you think with a poem, the form matters. So with a newspaper article, you might say, it doesn't matter. Okay, the article about stock market in China or something, It doesn't matter if I read it in blue ink, it doesn't matter how it's laid out on the page, or I read it on my phone, or I see it on a thing flashing by on the street, or whatever, or I hear it on the radio. It's irrelevant, it's the same story. Stock market's up, stock market's down. It's the content is irrelevant from the form. The poem, you normally think, well, but the content and the form are related. They're not, you can't talk about the one without the other. That's sort of the axiomatic claim that says, you cannot just talk about the content without the form. Now it's occurring to me, it would be interesting to try to do the heretical thing and say, no, I disagree. I'm just going to totally talk about the content with no reference to the form, just to see as an experiment. We won't do that. Okay, so we're back to structure. So we don't mean envelope. Okay, sorry, 178. It's certainly, as awesome. There's also a recommendation, like when you're writing, you should go through and cross out all your adverbs. Obviously, no. Certainly, not that. Next word. The structure, obviously. Oh, how do we not know? Is everywhere conditioned by the nature of the material which goes into the poem. The nature of the material sets the, there's a new metaphor, problem to be solved, and the solution is the ordering of the material. There's like 20 steps in there. And I'm not sure how many of them we want to go into. But the key, well, what strikes you there as most significant or most mysterious, and what, is there anything you might not agree with? It's not quite so obvious. Does anything bother you? Other than it's a lot of mouthfuls.
I'm not sure what he means by nature of material.
Yeah. The nature, okay, that's very nice. The nature of the material sets the problem, and the solution is the ordering of the material.
That says nothing to me.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question. The nature of the material. Well, so like let's look at one of these poems. Let's look at the wheelbarrow. Anyone want to read the red wheelbarrow aloud? It's very short.
I'll do it.
Please.
The red wheelbarrow. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow, glazed with rainwater, beside the white chickens.
Okay. So yeah, what's the nature of the material?
Agricultural.
Okay. Yeah, people often say that Williams is interested in, we'll look at a poem later, we'll look in some detail one of his poems later. People often say he's interested in objects and things. Things are very popular these days, partly because people are worried about the environment, partly for other reasons. People are interested in talking about things as having almost a life of their own separate from people. So Williams is kind of having a renaissance because he writes about things. And you might say, this is an interesting question, right? You might say in this poem, well, obviously the things are important because, you use the wheelbarrow, or you own the chickens, or the chickens, with reference to what's human. Maybe not. Yeah. All right. So yeah, the content. So that's sort of a way of what's like there. The nature is almost a theme. Agriculture, a farm, a house, something. I mean, or in some ways, it's also what it's not. It's not about war. It's not about the great armies. It's not about beauty. It's not about, well, maybe it is, but not directly. It's not about, I don't know. It's not about many things. I mean, everything except for every salary. So no. But yeah, okay. The nature of the material. And then problem to be solved. Now notice, so he then talks about this text by Alexander Pope called The Rape of the Lock, which is written in these couplets, this is 178, and cantos, and he says, that's not the structure. So the structure is not that the poem is divided into these two-line things with 3 words, 1 word. It's not the kind of couplet. it's not the fact that it's a mock epic. So the Rape of the Lock is sort of like a fake epic poem. It's like a joke about epic poetry. And he says that's not the structure. Right? So again, it's like if you were reading an essay that was a satire, he'd say the structure is not that it's prose in paragraphs. It's not that that's not structure. So it's seemingly not genre. And it's not even simply just the conventions. Like you might say that's a sonnet. It has 14 lines, 4-4-4-2 or something. You know, it's a Petrarchian sonnet, it's whatever. You say, no, that's not the structure. Now he's going to explain. The structure is a structure. So he says at the bottom 178. What's the structure? The structure is not helpful. Or is it? The structure is a structure of meanings, evaluations, and interpretations. And the unity which informs it is one of balancing and harmonizing connotations, attitudes, and meanings. Now, the question is that very specific and helpful, or is that very vague and unhelpful? Or both?
The latter, maybe.
Vague and unhelpful.
It gets better later as he gives examples, but
Yes,
I think alone it's
Yes.
not very
Okay, and that is actually already in itself part of the way he works. This is a very talky style. You know, you might read this essay and kind of get to the end and go, you know, he could have written this in 2 pages. It's like he keeps, no, you know what I mean? He keeps kind of talking, and then he finally gets to the section where he really kind of fleshes it out, and you're like, why did he wait so long to do this? But it's a style, and it's a very particular style. Perhaps one might imitate in certain, for various reasons. It's always a question like, why is that his style? Okay, so that is sort of the gamut, but that's good. Let's move on a little more quickly. Where do you think he starts telling us really? He starts fleshing this out. Where does he really start telling us? Okay, now I finally get it.
186.
Okay. Yeah. And what does he say? Notice now along the way in between, he's keep in mind that his goal in this essay, just as a kind of backdrop, his goal is sort of to argue against paraphrase. What is paraphrase? I mean, literally what it means, paraphrase, it's literally, you say something, you paraphrase. What does that mean?
Saying in your own words.
Yeah. It's like how you prove you didn't plagiarize. Wikipedia said this, but I reworded it. People who write the Wikipedia entries then get worried about plagiarizing themselves. Okay, yeah, you say it in your own words. You say the same thing differently. Now this takes us back to this form content thing. Now, paraphrase implies that that's possible. Right? In other words, if I come and I say something, and you can paraphrase it successfully, that means it is capable of being paraphrased. That means the content can be translated into another expression and not be destroyed. The whole argument about the poem here is that's impossible. That if you could paraphrase the Wed Wheelbarrow, it wouldn't be a poem. And indeed, you look at that and you go, how would I paraphrase that? It would be impossible. Right? And that's his point. And so what he's trying to get you to see is, now what can you paraphrase? What's something you can definitely paraphrase?
A news article?
Probably. Yeah. I mean, yeah, again, the news, article about weather, about something, content. Where all that matters is the content. And that's basically the point he's trying to make. He's trying to say, whatever it is about a poem, the content is not separable from the form. Okay. So that's the background challenge. Now, keep in mind, there's a lot behind that, He's, you can go into it. All right, so back to 186, which was your point. Here he starts telling us a little more about structure. What does he say? What does he help us? So again, we're trying to clarify what was going on in 178. Yes? I'm lost. But yeah, 178 he gave this vague version. Now in 186 he's going to give something much more. What do you like? What did you like here about 186? What does he say?
the analogies were incredibly helpful.
Yep.
In comparison to ballet and specifically
Oh, yeah.
a play.
Okay, okay. And notice now what he has to do, right? He's, and this will be important for Damon as well. He's trying to explain what structure is. And I mean, he's gonna now, as you said, he's gonna use analogies or metaphors to explain what structure is. So he's using literary devices or rhetorical devices to try to make this point. And that's, in general, a lot of literary criticism is just about trying to create a model of the text, right? Which is what he's doing here. And so the way you do it, and again, part of the reason it's so hard, right, is a text is something verbal. Your models of the text are themselves verbal. So, right, I mean, you say, what is literary, literary criticism is largely using language to talk about language. That's the difference to, say, biology, right? You can read an article on, mitochondria in a magazine. You will never confuse the language in the magazine with the mitochondria. There's a different order. You might very well confuse some of his phrases with some poems he was writing about. Right? They're all words. And that's what's hard about literary criticism, is it's words about words. Whereas, biology, it's words about, chemistry, words about electrical process, that's one of it's the words, so you use words to model words. And that's why I say it's always very mysterious, you see them equivocating with this word, that word, it's like, okay. So we like these analogies. So, he says, the essential structure of a poem resembles that of architecture or painting, a pattern of resolved stresses. Now, does anyone like that, architecture or painting? If so, what do you like? Or if you don't like, again, he's throwing out analogies, he's going to keep throwing them out. Again, it's another strategy. You say, why does he get to do all of these? Imagine if you turn this in as your own assignment, the teacher might say, pick one. You don't get to have 9 answers. I said, what's the structure? And you said, architecture and painting and poetry and dance. I said, what? No. That's part of, he piles these up, right? Again, that's his rhetorical strategy, is to kind of pile these up. It's a very specific strategy. So does anyone like, we'll get on to ballet, that's the one you like, but first, does anyone like architecture, painting, or what do those analogies do for you? Why are they helpful?
In one dimension, many colors and the shapes are put simultaneously to create certain effects of impression or influence to the viewer or listener or...
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. That's a great way. You have all these things going on at once, and they create an effect. And that's a really nice way to put it. So you read that Red Wheelbarrow poem, there's about 20 things happening at once, but you just get this effect. Sort of like you look at a painting. And I like that, it's like your stress on the dimensionality. In other words, it's what's nice about this analogy is it kind of keeps it a little simpler. It takes, it's just spatial, it's just on a plotting. It's not even 3D. Now, architecture will be the next one, that's 3D. But yeah, he starts in 2 dimensions, then he goes to 3 dimensions. Question? What's it?
Architecture and painting are concrete objects. You can touch them and they're tactile, but like music, you can't really touch it or something. Okay, and
it's very interesting. If you ever study the history of aesthetics, usually the way you hear the story is, it goes sort of, painting, sculpture, poetry, and then music and architecture are very complex. Some people think that music is far more complex than poetry, that it just presents all these, and then architecture is another weird one. But yes, certainly painting, and keep it simpler here, but painting and architecture, they are tangible, they're spatial. They're not temporal, they're not over time, they don't unfold. Now you walk through the building, seeing the first glance, you look at the building, you look at the painting. So that's nice, that works. Gives you the sense of, and it also, what's nice about these examples, right, is they really show you how, okay, if I look at what's a painting you like, anyone? Imagine looking at a painting and saying, let's divorce form from content. That distinction barely exists there. That's why it's so useful for him, right? There's almost no way, you might say, okay, well, Macbeth is about revenge or evil. I can say the content and the force. You might be able to, somehow separate form and content in the poetry, at least provisionally. But in those things, you never separate form and content. It's impossible. We're supposed to look at a Rothko painting, the blue, and you're like, separate form from content. Why? You wouldn't even know where to start. Right? And that's partly why those are very successful examples for him. They really show you these things are so interdependent. Right? He's making that claim. They're organically interdependent, right? All in the painting, all the different parts are, you couldn't rip them apart. You wouldn't even know how. Now, or to move closer to poetry by considering the temporal, notice it's a very interesting thing that language for him is going to be, it's over time. It's not like painting, it's not like sculpture, it's not like architecture, it's temporal. The structure resembles that of a ballet or a musical composition. So why do we like ballet and music? Why are those good?
There are arts that move people, like they move their emotions.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, they're definitely, you would never doubt that they were having an impact. It's an event. You go to the ballet, it's an event. You'd be struck by it. It unfolds over time. What else?
Like the art and architecture, or using an architecture analogy as well, it has many, many different components composed together in a particular manner to have one singular effect.
Okay.
Or aims to have one singular effect.
Yeah. So all these things work together. And of course you think of a great symphony, everything works together. Right? If I write a symphony, it'll just be a concatenation of noise. No one will ever mistake my music for a symphony. It'll just turn it off. But such is life. But the idea is, you say, what's so amazing? Well, there's a million parts, right? But they all work together. And so when you hear it, you're not drowning in the parts. You just hear the whole. And that's why that works for him. All of the parts go together to create a whole. Now, he says, now keep in mind, again, go back to my thing there. More internal, less internal, inside. I mean, we left that behind. You can think about that more later, it doesn't matter. But he's still doing it here. Now notice again the word. We're going to move closer to poetry. And this is very much, a romantic figure. There's this notion, like in turn of the 19th century in Romanticism. You remember your math from high school or something. You remember in calculus, you remember what an asymptote is? Right? So you have a graph, and an asymptote is when the function approaches it, gets infinitely close to it, or infinitesimally far away, but never quite reaches it. That's the asymptote. That's very much a romantic figure. In the late 18th, early 19th century, people were very interested in Leibniz. They were very interested in calculus. They were interested in infinitesimals, infinitely small, infinitely large. And this model of getting closer, it's a very rich aesthetic model. There's a lot you could think about that, relying on it. Notice here, right, it's a rhetorical model for him. It's like, he's like saying, yeah, I know. I'm giving you so many examples, but with each one you get a little closer. Right, now you might not believe him. You might say, the mere fact you have so many means you don't know what you're talking about. Because you know how that is, right? If you're having an argument with someone, you keep pulling it, and it's like, if you have 10 different examples, you don't know what you're doing, right? But he's saying, no, with each one I get closer. You might say, I disagree, with each one you get further away. That's the rhetorical power. The way these are why these people are very successful. They're very rhetorically sophisticated. You can learn how to argue from these fellows. These peoples. Okay, so we're going to get even closer. All right, maybe. The structure of a poem resembles a play. Why is that even better? This is where it gets really messy. Why is a play even better?
He talks about dynamic nature and external dynamics of drama.
The dynamic nature of drama allows us to regard it as an action rather than as a formula for action or as a statement about action. So the Red Wheelbarrow, the poem, it's not a formula for action, it's not a statement about action, it's an action. commentary. It's always my word. It's comment. Commentary.
I think this is like the first real justification for close reading, and that if in itself the red wheelbarrow is the action, and it's not a statement of the action.
Yeah.
You're just looking at the action itself. You're not trying to decipher what the statement behind the action
Okay,
is.
excellent. Excellent. That's a great point. Does everyone get that? If you see, so if you think of the poem, and another word you could use is it's almost an event itself. So, like you said, I go and I see the ballet performed. I hear the symphony. And this is the difference, right? If I even says this, right? Like if I just wave, the musical script of Beethoven's Fifth something or other, actually you say, okay, that's not the symphony. The symphony is I go and I hear it performed. That's sort of what he's saying is he's saying when you read the red wheelbarrow, you have to think of it not like you would the musical sheets. You have to think of it as the symphony happening, which is a big stretch, right? Because you can see this and you want to think it's like, well, no, it's like musical notation. But that's he's saying, no. He's saying the reading of the poem is almost like an event. It's the experience of the symphony. It happens. And I think that's great. I like what you say, that's really now you're saying that's, now why is that the justification for close reading?
Because this in itself is a complete incident. You don't need to look at, looking at the components, or I guess the behind story, like looking at the rehearsal to a play wouldn't really actually help you in interpreting the play.
Okay.
So you're looking at that end result, I think, and because he says that end result is the action, and that's what you're actually looking at, then it makes looking at that completed form more important.
Okay.
I think.
Yeah. No, I like that. I like that. The action. Does this bother anybody? Is there anything you don't like about this? You don't have to like it. You don't have to agree with it, but sometimes you learn more by disagreeing. Is there anything about that, or is there anything that seems a little like he's cheating, he's fudging?
I see what he means, and I see how that one poem can have that unified effect, but I think there's still, if you're going to use the play analogy, I mean, the script as a text in itself can have value.
Yeah. Yeah, plays, and he says that, right? He says, plays a genre, it's a kind of, he basically says, I'm using a version of poetry to explain what poetry is. I'm using dramatic poetry. I'm using an example, this is where it gets weird. I'm using a type of literature to explain what literature is. I'm modeling literature on literature. I mean, again, think about that. It's like if you said, I'm going to explain what cats are by showing you by using Siamese cats as the model of cat, or it's like.
It's a bit circular.
Yeah, but that's when it goes back to my thing. When I was just saying, it's about using language to talk about language. You always run into these circularities, right? For example, the theory of metaphor, the history of metaphor since Aristotle. What is it? It's an effort to make metaphors of metaphors. Right? That's what it is. Right? That's what it is. That's where you get these incredible philosophical problems. But this is the same thing. He acknowledges this. Again, another good strategy I would recommend to you when you're writing. When you know you're kind of fudging a little, acknowledge it. That way no one can point it out, but because you know you're doing it. You don't pretend, don't hope no one will notice. You say, yes, it's true, I'm using a type of literature as the model for literature. But I've told you so there. So you're like, But that's a classic example. He uses the play as a model for the whole thing. Now it is interesting that he says, how interesting is it? So it's 11:15. You want to take a break? Is this a good time to take a break?
Sure.
Take like a 15-20-minute break. Any rest? All right. And then, hold on. When we come back, he'll make some more points about this. what I would like us to do when we come back, is maybe we'll divide up these poems or something. What I'd like us when we come back would be to try to say about one of these, well, maybe we'll do a reading. When we come back, let's try together to read one of these poems, these William Carlos Williams poems, called A Sort of a Song. It's on the top of the page, Let the Snake Wait Under His Reed in the Writing. Let's try to talk about that poem together when we come back, because it will both address a lot of the problems that Brooks deals with, and it will look forward to a lot of the things in the demand. So let's try to do that. But yeah, let's take a break. 15, 20 minutes.